Hello everyone, welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy, the Hindu news analysis. So today is 18th June 2024 and we have few important articles for today's discussion. So without any delay, we will try to discuss and understand all those important articles in an exam relevant and an exam specific manner. And when we talk about the important articles for today's discussion, the first and foremost thing that we need to understand is about the Antarctica Treaty. Right, so we all knew that this Antarctic continent is a very pristine and it is also one of the global commons. However, now when I say global commons, it is not the property, or no country have sovereign rights over any place which is part of the global commons. However, in recent times, human footprint has been considerably increasing in this Antarctica continent, and therefore it has resulted in the stress on the environment of Antarctica, right? So, and at the same time, it leads to the erosion of the pristine environment over Antarctica, and I will understand how can we ensure the sustainable sustainability of Antarctica continent, and what exactly India's role in ensuring the sustainability of Antarctic continent. And secondly, we will understand a peace conference that was recently conducted by Switzerland, right? So the objective of this peace conference is to gain greater support to Ukraine in this Russia-Ukraine war. And in fact, Switzerland has actually invited a lot of countries, and India was also part of this particular peace conference. However, India did not vote in favor of supporting Ukraine unilaterally, because we can say that there was no participation of Russia in this conference, and it is very often seen as a unilateral conference. And since Russia's views were not taken into consideration and India did not vote either yes or no in this peace conference, rather India abstained from voting on this particular conference, even though India was part of this conference. And thirdly, we will also understand about the aging societies, aging economies, and how the old age population has been facing a number of issues, right? So number of challenges, whether it is with respect to health care and adequate food and nutrition and care from the families. Now we will understand this from the multiple dimensions, and we will also make sure that what are the government schemes which were launched, government initiatives which were launched for the benefit of the old age people or senior citizens, and what should be the way forward so that all elderly and senior citizens would get adequate care, adequate healthcare facilities, and also adequate nutrition, etc. Now, before proceeding, yesterday I have given one practice question. The question was, Meghaduta is a lyric poem. It was composed by who among the following? And this is, I've already told you that this is very, very important. So this is a lyric poem which was composed by Kalidasa. Kalidasa composed Meghadutam, and it is a lyric poem. Now you can see the explanation. Kalidasa was a classical Sanskrit writer. We all knew that Kalidasa was a court scholar under Chandragupta II. Okay, so he was a court scholar under Chandragupta II, and he was also one of the Navaratnas under Chandragupta II, right? So he was a classical Sanskrit writer, and he was regarded as the greatest poet and dramatist in the Sanskrit language in India, right? So he was the greatest poet and dramatist in Sanskrit language in India, and Meghaduta is Kalidasa's best known poem, in which monsoon cloud, right? So in this Meghadutam, Kalidasa used monsoon cloud, and he imagined this particular monsoon cloud as a messenger between the lovers who were separated from one another. So this was the story behind Kalidasa's Meghadutam, and understand that, remember that it is a classical Sanskrit poem. Okay. Now Today also I have given one more practice question. Consider the following crops, and a number of crops were given. How many of the above mentioned crops are majorly kharif crops? And we all knew that there are number of seasons in India, 3 different seasons in India: kharif season, Rabi season, and also another season was Jaid season, right? So Kharif season also a number of crops are cultivated, Rabi season different crops cultivated, and followed by Jaid season. So we all knew that the Kharif season generally starts from June to September, and Rabi season starts from October to around March, right? And these 2 years, April and May, is Jaid season. So therefore, the crops which are being cultivated: maize, groundnut, mustard, gram, and sunflower. And how many of the above mentioned crops are majorly kharif crops? So you just answer this question in the comment section, and for the correct answer, I'll be giving you tomorrow. Now we'll start this discussion without any delay. Firstly, we talk about this Antarctica Treaty. So what is the context? The context is that recently the 46th Antarctica Treaty consultative meeting. So this is Antarctica Treaty consultative meeting, and this Antarctica Treaty consultative meeting was 46th, and this was recently held in Kochi. You just remember this Antarctica Treaty consultative meeting. So this was the 46th meeting, and it was held in Kochi. And it has highlighted a number of complexities in regulating tourism in Antarctica. Now, what happens with increasing tourist footfall in Antarctica? There may be chances that this footprint may erode the pristine nature of Antarctica. And because of that reason, it has identified a number of complexities in regulating tourism in Antarctica, and an area governed by international consensus. And also it has been facing a rapid environmental changes as well. Now, what is the controversy surrounding Antarctica tourism? We need to understand this. So there is a controversy which is surrounding Antarctic tourism. Now, when we talk about this Antarctica tourism, first we need to look into the data. Now, data has been clearly revealing us that since 1990s, tourist footfall in Antarctic continent significantly increased. For example, the tourists exceeding 1 lakh in 22-23. So this is actually a huge increase in the tourist footfall in Antarctica. The number of tourists have been significantly and disproportionately increasing. And the growth driven by the interest in adventure travel, and this particular tourism and adventure travel, the tourist interest in adventure travel, so will actually have a disproportionate impact on the environment in Antarctic. Now, what environmental concerns are actually generated because of this irresponsible tourist or increasing tourist footfall? Now, increased human presence will lead to the disruption of the existing wildlife in Antarctica, and it also leads to the damaging the existing fragile ecosystems. Okay, so now Antarctic continent remain one of the continent which is protected by the global cooperation, but when this tourism has been disproportionately increasing, there is a chance that this invasive alien species may also introduced in this Antarctic continent, and that will lead to the destruction of existing native ecosystem in Antarctica. So along that, tourism also contributes to the pollution of the existing environment and increasing carbon footprint, and this also significantly exacerbates the climate change impact on the vulnerable ecosystems of Antarctica continent. We all knew that whenever tourism is not regulated, it in fact actually carries a lot of harmful impacts along with it, and thereby polluting, contaminating the existing pristine and fragile ecosystems, and that is the consequence of unregulated tourism into Antarctica. So therefore, what should be the way forward? The way forward should be there should be a balance between benefits and risks. We need to identify the benefits and at the same time the risks, right? So tourism actually offers educational and economic benefits, But on the other hand, it also significantly increases the pressure on the environment. So therefore, there should be a balance between scientific research, responsible tourism, and environmental protection in Antarctic, right? I hope you have understood the controversy surrounding Antarctic. Now, if we allow tourists into Antarctic, so that will have a number of negative environmental impacts on the continent. So therefore, what we should do, we should promote the scientific research, responsible tourism, and environmental protection in Antarctic, and at the same time we need to regulate tourism also. Now, in this context, there are certain global governance and policy implications with respect to the Antarctic Treaty. Now, what are the global governance architecture which was established for the protection of Antarctica continent? Now, earlier, the first attempt to protect Antarctic continent was the Antarctica Treaty that was established in 1961. So, in 1961, this Antarctica or Antarctic Treaty was first established, and along with that there was also a Madrid Protocol, and both Antarctic Treaty and Madrid Protocol provide broad guidelines, but they lack specific tourism regulations. So since they are lacking specific tourism regulations, tourism was not regulated in Antarctica continent, and therefore due to the increasing tourist footfall into the Antarctic continent, it is very important that we must ensure there should be a regulated tourism and tourism related activities in the Antarctica continent. And apart from that, International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators. So this is a firm, a body, so which looks after the Antarctica tourism, currently self-regulates, which many views as insufficient. So the self-regulation of International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators is self-regulatory body, but this self-regulation is not sufficient. However, the Antarctica Treaty, a consultative meeting that was recently held, it actually requires an anonymous agreement for decisions of often hampering effective regulation. And apart from that, the national interests and differing interpretations of Antarctic principles further complicate the governance in the Antarctica Treaty also. However, when we look into the recent developments within the Antarctica continent, now in this recent developments, this Antarctica Treaty consultative meeting this is a 46th meeting, and it has actually made a lot of progress in establishing a working group so that actually develops a comprehensive regulatory framework to regulate tourism in Antarctica continent. However, there are a number of challenges still need to be addressed in achieving consensus. So we need to achieve consensus among all the members which are part of this Antarctica Treaty. Only then any such measures can be resulted in an achievable policy goals. So therefore, it is also very important that we need to implement those regulations to prevent the disruption of the fragile nature of Antarctica continent by irresponsible tourism. However, there are certain challenges with respect to implementation and ensuring inclusivity of whatever regulation that we have brought, and at the same time promoting the pristine and ecological nature of the Antarctica continent. Now first we need to look into the historical challenges. Now what are the major historical challenges that are in place, right? So for example, whenever we made efforts to regulate tourism, so they are actually being debated a lot since 1960s. So first there was a tourism annex that was proposed in 1991 with respect to regulation of tourism, that was actually failed. So leading to the reliance on International Association of Arctic Tourist Operators, right? This Arctic Tourist Operators is a self-regulatory body. However, there are fragmented approach. There was no inclusive approach so far, and these fragmented and approaches with lack of political will resulted in non-binding guidelines rather than a comprehensive regulation of tourism or any other activities in the Antarctica continent. So however, this anonymous approval, right? So approval from every member of the Antarctica continent will lead to the decision making by non-decision making. Okay, so because where unregulated activities will further continue. So therefore, proposals such as banning permanent tourism facilities have failed due to lack of consensus among all the members. Now, even there were attempts earlier to prevent tourism, completely ban tourism in the Antarctic continent, because tourism in Antarctic continent actually leading to the unintended negative consequences on the existing environment. However, those efforts were failed to ban, the efforts to ban tourism from Antarctic were failed because there was lack of consensus from all the countries, right? So whenever a treaty was established for the protection of a particular region, now all the member countries should have agreed for the banning of tourism and tourism related activities in that particular continent, and otherwise it would be difficult to ban tourism. So even one or two countries cannot do such things. So, however, it is very important that we must identify and understand India's role in protection of pristine and fragile ecosystem in Antarctic continent, because so India recently has been emphasizing that there's a need to address tourism impacts on research and conservation of this Antarctic continent, and this is what India has been said. So tourism not just having impact on the pristine ecosystem of Antarctica, but also impacting the research which is undergoing in the Antarctic continent. So therefore, despite a lot of international challenges, because there's a lack of consensus, there's lack of regulations, and there's lack of a common single body which enforces these regulations, India enacted its own law. So that was Antarctica law in 2022, and through this Antarctic law in 2022, India has advocated for a robust environmental protection and monitoring of this Antarctic continent. And here you have to remember this Antarctica law of 2022 for the protection and conservation of Antarctic continent from India's side, and at the same time regulate tourism from India. Right, so this is what with respect to Antarctic continent, and how tourism has been impacting the Antarctic continent, and what are the challenges with respect to the regulation of tourism, and how if any measures were taken to regulate or ban tourism, how can we implement, and what are the challenges in implementing those regulations, we have discussed in a detailed manner. So the next question, the next topic that we are going to discuss is about the negotiating for peace. India's decision to end but not vote at Swiss conference was a right. Now I'll be telling you that understand this peace conference, as I've already told you that this is also known as Swiss Peace Conference. Okay, so Swiss Peace Conference. Now what was the purpose of this Swiss Peace Conference? So the purpose was to gain more support to Ukraine in this Russia-Ukraine war. We can say that this is a conference of all the Western countries which are trying to get support for Ukraine against Russia. Okay, so to rally greater support behind Ukraine and other Western countries rather than Russia. So therefore, in this particular Swiss Peace Conference, Russia was not part of this conference, and in fact, not just Russia, and even China was also not part of this particular Swiss Peace Conference. So however, India was part of this Swiss Peace Conference, but at the end, India did not vote in favor of the resolution which was introduced in Swiss Peace Conference, and the resolution talking about the complete support for Ukraine. So since both Russia and Ukraine were not brought together by this Peace Conference, India was generally abstained from the voting. However, India always supports such initiatives, right? So peaceful settlement of disputes is one of the India's major aim of settling the international disputes between two different sovereign countries. So since however this particular Swiss Peace Conference did not bring Russia into it, so India generally not in favor of giving oath to the resolution which was introduced by Swiss Peace Conference. So this Swiss Peace Conference is also known as Summit on Peace. So this was a 2-day summit on peace that ended on Sunday in Birkenstock, met with the mixed outcomes. So there was no anonymous single outcome, but rather there were mixed outcomes, and we will understand what are those mixed outcomes. Now before discussing that, we'll understand the Russia-Ukraine war very briefly. Now when I say Russia-Ukraine war, in fact, in the year 2022 February, Russia attacked Ukraine, and when Russia attacked Ukraine with the pretext that Ukraine has been violating the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Russia, joining hands with the Western allies or Western countries. Countries which are part of the Western Europe and US. So therefore, after the Russia attack, all the European countries, what they have done, they have imposed sanctions on Russia. They have imposed sanctions, and apart from imposing sanctions, they immediately stopped the sourcing of oil and natural gas from Russia. So in order to economically cripple down the Russia's economy. However, Russia alternatively looked for other important players in the region, for example India and China, right? So due to India and China, their heavy energy demands or heavy energy needs, what they have done, they have significantly imposed crude oil from Russia, and thereby Russia has to some extent able to withstand the Western sanctions. And in fact, Russia along with other like-minded countries have also looked for other alternatives to dollar, and in that particular stance they try to create this BRICS currency for the de-dollarization of the world economy or the global economy. However, when we talk about this Russia-Ukraine war, so without any doubt, all the Western countries were supporting Ukraine in this particular war. However, there's no clear outcome in this Russia-Ukraine war. This war still going on. However, if you look at the India's stance, India is not in favor of war or violence. Rather, India always supports any diplomatic effort between these two countries or settling disputes through diplomacy and negotiations. So this is India's stance. And a recent summit that was convened by Switzerland was Summit of Peace. So this summit was known as Summit of Peace. Now Switzerland was able to bring together around more than 90 countries. Okay, so in the Summit of Peace, so this was organized by Switzerland, and Switzerland was able to bring around 90 countries to attend the Summit of Peace. However, 56 countries were represented by leaders, and within 56 countries, leaders were took part in the Summit of Peace. However, when we talk about this final joint communique which was issued or resolution, it is like a declaration or resolution of this particular peace summit. So this final communique was signed by about 82 countries and organizations, with the exception of few, including India. Okay, so with just an exception of few countries, because if you look at the countries, total countries, 90 countries have joined, but out of 90 countries, the final joint communique was signed by just 82 countries. Okay, so with the exception of a few, including India. Now when we talk about this final communique, the document made a strong call for an end to this particular ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, especially talking a tough language against Russia. And at the same time, it also pitched for or asked about the sovereignty, or demanded the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and adherence to the international law, because most of these Western countries believe that Russia's aggression against Ukraine violated the sovereignty and territorial integrity, and it is also against the international law. So therefore, all these countries have time and again asked Russia to stop its attacks on Ukraine. So again, this final joint communique of the Summit of Peace has also emphasized on sovereignty, territorial integrity, and also adherence to the international law as well. And apart from that, we all knew that because of Russia-Ukraine war, there were a number of areas at the global level which were actually impacted severely. For example, we need to talk about this energy security. So it gets impacted because of the Russia-Ukraine war. And apart from energy security, food security has also faced a strong crisis, right? So why? Because both Russia and Ukraine, together known as the wheat basket of the world, so they were known as the wheat basket of the world. And when we talk about this energy security, so earlier European countries heavily dependent on Russia for their crude oil and this natural gas. So since they have imposed sanctions on Russia because of this Russia-Ukraine war, so these European countries are also coming into the Middle East markets, and that led to the increasing demand and lower production, and further increasing the crude oil prices, and that is not benefiting the developing countries like India and other South Asian countries. And therefore, the Summit on Peace actually talked about the nuclear safety and security, because now if you look at the Russia-Ukraine war, Russia is a nuclear power state, and Russia has also been planning to develop tactical nuclear weapons. So these tactical nuclear weapons create destruction at a very small scale. So therefore it talks about nuclear safety and food security, as I've already told you, right? So food security and the exchange of prisoners of war, displaced and detained Ukrainians. So this is what the final joint communique of this Summit of Peace actually talked about or touched on different areas, right? So what are the shortcomings of this particular peace summit of peace, right? So when we talk about the shortcomings of this Summit of Peace, now in fact Switzerland's decision not to invite Russia, so Russia was not part of this Summit of Peace, and that is one of the shortcomings, because whenever we are organizing a conference, we need to make sure that both the parties which are in this conflict should be brought to the table. However, Switzerland decides that it will not invite Russia and to build their negotiations on the basis of Ukrainian peace formula, right? So it will give a sense that these countries are anonymously supporting Ukrainian cause, but on the other hand not bringing Russia. So it is a half-hearted attempt from the organizers of this Summit of Peace. Okay, so therefore this particular Summit of Peace has been demanding a peace formula along with UN resolutions, and in fact all these things actually made appear one-sided because they have not invited Russia into this meeting. And apart from that, this particular Summit on Peace also failed to convince China on its side, because when you look into the China and Russia relationship, China without a doubt one of the key ally and one of the key partners for Russia, but this Swiss peace conference or Swiss peace summit organizers failed to convince China to bring China also to this table. So that is also one of the shortcomings of this Summit on Peace, because China arguably have a lot of influence on Moscow, that is Russia. So to even send a delegation was another blow. Okay, so China was not even part of this particular Summit on Peace, and that is another blow for this summit. And in fact, we all knew that the BRICS group of countries constitutes Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. Though no BRICS member, the current members or the future members. Recently, we also knew that 5 different members were also included in this BRICS grouping, right? For example, Saudi Arabia became a member of BRICS grouping, and United Arab Emirates also became the member. Iran became the member of this BRICS grouping, and along with Iran, Egypt was also became member, and Ethiopia, right? So these are the 5 more members which were joined into this earlier existing 5-member BRICS grouping, right? So they actually signed a statement to indicate that it was non-starter among the emerging economies. And after that, as a close partner of Russia, a key global South player. So we're talking about India, because India also has a significant relation with Russia, and at the same time India is very often considers itself as a leader of the global South. So India always tried to kept a balance in this conflict, and India's stance always was dialogue and diplomacy, and peaceful settlement of the dispute between these two parties was the stance of India. So therefore India's presence in this particular peace summit is certainly a positive take for this Summit on peace. Okay, so we can consider this as a major win for the organizers of this summit. Now, India always try to balance the western interests with its eastern interests. So therefore it tried to balance between Russia and its western allies. However, even though India was not voted in this particular summit on peace, so India's participation, because India is a key ally or key partner of Russia, and at the same time it is also one of the representative of the global south, so we can consider that it is one of the major win for India, even though India did not vote in favor of the final joint communique. So in fact, India, if you look at India's stance now and previously also, so India has consistently abstained from every resolution at the United Nations. So for example, any resolution which is introduced in United Nations, Security Council and International Atomic Energy Agency, Human Rights Council, or any other multilateral fora, so which actually, that resolution which criticizes Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, and India consistently abstained from such resolutions, and in fact India did not vote either yes or no in such resolutions which directly criticizes Russia for its invasion on Ukraine. Okay, so this indicating that India's balancing stands between its western interests and at the same time Russia also. However, India also shares certain concerns over much of the text which is released at this conference. Okay, so Swiss Peace Conference, it could not have gone ahead with its overtly anti-Russian stance. And apart from that, so India's decision to attend this conference but not endorse its outcome. Okay, so it did not endorse the outcomes of a final joint communique of this peace conference. Rather, India did take part in this conference, so was probably a foregone conclusion that, so earlier also India did not take any direct, or India actually abstained from such resolutions which criticizes Russia's aggression on Ukraine, and at the same time India's abstention from this final joint communique voting, indicating that India trying to balance its ties between Russia and the Western partners, and trying to continue this stance in the future also. Right, so next article that we are going to discuss is about the aging society in India. Okay, so in this context, what are the vulnerabilities that the elderly have been facing in India? Now, if you look at the number of countries, mostly the developed countries in the world, even if you look at Japan and China and countries like Italy and Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, so most of these countries are having the aging societies. So these societies are known as aging societies. Why aging societies? So they are aging societies because the birth rate is very low in these countries, and at the same time the elderly population as a proportion of total population is very high. And because of that reason, these societies are known as aging societies, and along with the aging societies, the expenditure of the government will be very high compared to the revenue that it has been generating, because most of the people are in the older age. Older age people do not generally actively take part in the economic activities, and since there is a stagnant or lower birth rate in these countries, countries' expenses or expenditure is very high compared to the revenue. But fortunately, India has been going through a phase of demographic dividend where we have a youngest population in the world. However, it is expected that this demographic window will last for another 15 to 20 years, and after that India's old age population will start increasing. Now we need to prepare our economy, and we need to prepare our governments and our people to make sure that we accommodate our aging economies or aging societies. And in this context, it is very important that adequate care, adequate health care, so care from the family, adequate care, adequate health care, and the security for the elderly is very, very important, right? So in this context, we'll understand about all these things. So firstly, the aging phenomenon is the most notable experience of this century, because throughout the world, different countries which have been going through the phase of aging. So with remarkable improvement in the human longevity and it is being complemented by the lowest levels of reproduction. Now the birth rate has been either stagnating and it is further declining. Okay, so therefore the magnitude and multiplication of the population and especially the aging population is one of the threatening issue that we are going to face, right? So when we talk about the aging economies, aging societies, or the elderly population, 4 different vulnerabilities are being highlighted at the later ages in the life. So what are those vulnerabilities? For example, so activities of daily living, multimorbidity in the sense that the elderly population generally faces the risk of multiple diseases, so multimorbidity, and they also have the poverty because they don't take part in the economic activity, so therefore they do not have the financial security. And in fact in India, 96% of the not 96%, around 90% of the population are in the unorganized sector. So unorganized sector, they do not have adequate social security and financial security after their retirement. So this will lead to the poverty, and poverty will lead to lack of care and inadequate medical care, etc. Right? So absence of any sort of income. So these are the 4 vulnerabilities that the elderly generally faces. Okay, so when we talk about this longitudinal aging survey of India, longitudinal aging survey of India, so LASI, this particular survey has reported that about 20% of the elderly population has been experiencing different types of vulnerabilities. Now when I say different types of vulnerabilities, you can code these 4 types of vulnerabilities, right? So for example, daily living activities, so it will be very difficult for the elderly population to do these daily activities on their own, rather they require support from their family members. Okay, so after that, the multimorbidity, poverty, and inadequate income, so that are the major problems that the elderly population faces, right? So this survey is also highlights that elderly population experiences these vulnerabilities that we have already discussed. However, the remedy or the suggestion actually required a multi-pronged approach, a comprehensive approach, so that must be undertaken to ensure that these vulnerabilities are actually overcome by the elderly population. And government support is also very important to ensure that the principles of inclusion and adoption of social security measures from the government side, right? So when we talk about the care and protection of this elderly community, because they are also vulnerable categories, once they become old age, they become vulnerable categories and they need to be given adequate care, right? So this care provisioning of elderly population essentially includes the social security and the financial protection, assuming that prominence in households with elderly compared with those without them, right? So for example, imagine that elderly population living in a family. In that particular family, elderly actually require a lot of care and support from that particular family. Okay, so otherwise it would be very difficult for the elderly population to do their daily activities, and lack of adequate care or neglect of elderly population in the families so will lead to the miserable life in their last years. And contrasting today's elderly with tomorrow's, there is every possibility of characteristic advantage in terms of education. Now if you look into the present day elderly population, future elderly population, so there is actually a difference between education and life preparation of elderly population. Everyone taking insurance policies, and everyone joining different pension schemes, etc., savings. So therefore in tomorrow's or in future elderly population, there will be a change in education between a present elderly and the future elderly, and they also well prepared, most of them. And apart from that, the economic dependence, but adversities in health and quality of living owing to rising longevity in the sense that the life expectancy rate of elderly population has been significantly increasing, and that will actually poses number of healthcare challenges. We need to provide healthcare to the elderly population because of their longevity, and emergence of long-term chronic ailments is also one of the challenge. So whenever the elderly population since they face multiple morbidities, there is a chance that over a period of time they will also suffer with this long-term chronic ailments, and that actually requires a lot of financial support from the government, from the families, and at the same time the elderly population also requires a lot of care. However, the slogan of healthy aging, so this is a very very important slogan, right? So there's no doubt that in any society we cannot stop aging. However, one thing that we can ensure is that aging must be healthy and sustainable in nature, right? So the elderly population can live a peaceful life in their elder ages. So they need to focus on elderly population, but the perspective elderly to a large extent. Okay. Now we need to focus on healthy aging, and that should be the focus of the hour, right? So after that, the projected magnitude of the elderly population is as of now estimated to be 319 million by mid-century. So it will be growing by 3% every year, and over a period of time the number of old age people will significantly and drastically increases. However, the elderly population faces number of challenges, numerous problems, right? So when we talk about the present status of the elderly health care, it is reported that a quarter of the elderly are poor. Now imagine that the 100 people are elderly, and out of 100 more than quarter of the people are in poverty, right? So while 75% of the elderly populations are victims of chronic diseases in the sense that they are long-term diseases. For example, tuberculosis, a long-term disease, right? So these kind of a long-term diseases require a long-term medical care and at the same time expenses from the family, right? So since most of the insurances are not extended to the elderly population after 60 years, 65 years, so there will be a disproportionate burden on the families and the government to provide care for the elderlies. Now this particular health status and the data has been indicating that quarter of the elderly population are poor, and apart from that 75% of the elderly population have also been facing numerous chronic diseases. Now chronic diseases are long-term diseases, and 40% of those people who have been facing this chronic diseases and those aged above 45 are one or other disability. So some people, especially the elderly people, also having some sort of a disability, and disability will increases the dependency, the chances of dependency of such people on the family members. So therefore, in fact, it is apparent that two threatening forces are diabetes and cancer. So these are two threatening forces when we talk about the elderly care or the chronic diseases and the disabilities that are suffering, that the elderly are suffering. Diabetes and cancer were responsible, and they appear to be more frequent among India's elderly. However, one other emerging concerns with respect to the elderly population is the mental health issues. Now, in fact, in India, we do not have any institutionalized mechanism to address this mental health. And in fact, in most of these cases, mental health as a health problem is not at all recognized. So that is also a problem, and most of the elderly population, due to lack of adequate care and adequate support from their family, so they have been going through a lot of mental health issues, right? So with 20% of those aged above 45 self-supporting, self-reporting that they have some form of ailment with respect to this mental health, and that is primarily caused by the depression that they have been facing. Okay, so apart from that, the elderly population also having also facing the food insecurity. Now food insecurity in the sense that they do not have adequate food and adequate nutrition. So when they do not take adequate food and adequate nutrition, it actually gives a scope for other diseases and weakening immunity of the elderly. Now they do not have the adequate food either because they're not eating the food, but the other reason is that they are poor and they lack constant income. Okay, so there are inadequate government support mechanisms. Okay, so all these factors, what they have been they are making these existing issues more and more complex to address. right? So whenever they do not have adequate food and adequate nutritious food is not taken, so that increases the chance of new diseases and morbidities among this elderly population, and over a period of time these diseases would become chronic diseases, right? So however, when we talk about the elderly population, recognizing these adversities among the challenges that these elderly population have been facing is very, very important. Okay, so the protection measures which are in place in terms of welfare provisioning need to be done. Okay, so adequate welfare measures should be undertaken for this elderly population, and there should be a legal recourse as well as the concessional measures for this group of population is very, very important, right? So these are kind of a measures we need to think about the elderly population, right? So that we can ensure a healthy and sustainable aging for this elderly population in all these countries, especially in India. So however, it is said that hardly 12% or only 12% are aware about the Maintenance and Welfare of Parents and Senior Citizens Act of 2007, right? So this particular act was passed in the 2007, Maintenance and Welfare of Parents and Senior Citizens Act. Okay, so MWP and Senior Citizens Act of 2007. Now this act was passed to ensure that no no kids or no children of the parents would actually leave the parents in their elder age, right? So they actually take care of their parents in their later ages, in their old ages, and at the same time they ensure a healthy aging for the children, right? So and 28% are aware about various concessions which are being offered to the elderly. So therefore, in this context, we need to enhance the element of awareness about the legislative measures which are provided, and at the same time the government schemes and policies which were launched for the benefit of elderly population. So while 5% of them 5% of the population that are aware about the various concessions for the elderly report abuse, they are quite frequent, and particularly for women in rural areas where they remain the most neglected, right? So in these rural areas, women, especially the elderly and women, have been facing the abuse also. So there are a number of challenges to address with respect to the elderly population, but the ultimate goal is healthy and sustainable aging we need to focus on. So in order to do that, there is a need for a number of policy incentives, initiatives from the government, and at the same time the statutory measures to protect the elderly population through an umbrella of number of initiatives, right? Now this image has been indicating that over a period of time, this is how the burden of elderly population will increase on the newly born people, right? So for example, imagine that if Indian economy becomes an aging economy, but on the other hand, number of youth who actually supports the economy are less, but the elderly population or the people who are dependent on the younger population who supports the economy, or elderly population are more, but the people who supports the economy are very less. So that is how the burden actually increases on the young people who supports this economy, right? So that's, and apart from that, there are other measures also that have to be taken. So measures include movement towards creating a social agency for the vulnerable group is the need of the hour. So we need to create a social agency for the vulnerable group of people, and this particular social agency will ensure protection of these vulnerable section of the society. And apart from that, there should be an innovative forms of institutions that can be brought in place to alter the valuation from liability to asset. So there are chances that we can convert the liability into an asset with respect to the old age population, and we need to look into these innovative forms of innovative ways of converting the liability into an asset. And there needs to be a focus on ensuring an active life course for the future elderly. So all these things have to be taken in order to ensure a healthy aging for the elderly populations. Okay, so that's all in this lecture, and thank you so much. So if you have any suggestions, you just write those suggestions in the comment section, and also make sure that you like a video and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you.